In the heart of ancient Angola, where rivers carve through deep green forests and the soil bleeds red with memory, a girl named Nzinga was born, marked by fate to change her world. She was no ordinary child. Raised in a royal court of warriors and whispers, Nzinga learned early that survival required more than strength. It demanded courage, cunning, and the fire of resistance. As she grew, so did the threat. Portuguese invaders crept inland, trading guns for flesh, turning neighbors into enemies, and kings into pawns in a game soaked with betrayal. Nzinga's brother sat on the throne, worn and wary. His kingdom crumbled under treaties he couldn't control, while the people watched the crown dim in foreign hands. To face the invaders, Nzinga was sent to negotiate. When she arrived, the Portuguese offered no seat, only cold stone, so she made one, using the back of a loyal servant. She sat tall, meeting their eyes without flinch. It wasn't just a message of defiance, it was a lesson in dignity, carved into history with a silent, royal gaze. Her words were sharp, regal, and wise. The Portuguese signed a treaty that day, but Nzinga knew better. Peace made in chains is still a prison. After her brother's death, the throne did not pass easily. Men doubted her right, but Nzinga took it, declaring herself queen, ready to lead, ready to fight for her people's soul. She transformed her kingdom into a fortress. Warriors followed her through the jungle's breathless dark, striking swift and vanishing like mist, leaving only fear in their wake. Nzinga built unlikely alliances, joining with rival tribes and Dutch soldiers, uniting under one purpose: to defy the empire that hunted them like animals. She welcomed escaped slaves into her army, trained women to fight, and turned every tree, every cliff, into a blade of rebellion waiting to fall. To the Portuguese, her forest kingdom was a mystery, a place where roads led nowhere, and Nzinga's will shaped the land like the rain-shaped stone. Years passed. War bled into war, but Nzinga remained, unyielding, undefeated. And when the Portuguese begged for peace again, she made sure her people stood above the deal. Even in her 60s, she led from the front, riding horseback, spear in hand, a queen with fire in her eyes and no space in her heart for surrender. 40 years she fought, 40 years she ruled. Nzinga outlived kings, bent empires, and turned her name into thunder whispered through the trees. She died not as a prisoner, not as a shadow, but as a queen. Her legacy still walks the soil of Angola, telling every child, rise and never kneel. Nzinga had fought long. She had bled, resisted, negotiated, and defied every trap her enemies laid. But her journey was far from over. After decades of war and heartbreak, the queen stood not only as a survivor, but as a living monument of resistance. Her youth had burned with fire, but her age brought a new kind of power, sharper, deeper, harder to crush. The forest whispered her name. The rivers carried her legend. She no longer needed to prove herself. She was Nzinga, queen of the Ndongo and Matamba, breaker of chains, voice of a people too proud to bow. Though her body aged, her mind only grew keener. She didn't ride into every battle anymore, but her strategies won wars. She trained leaders. She raised warriors. She became the heartbeat of a kingdom that knew no fear. Her enemies kept coming. The Portuguese, tired and frustrated, still couldn't understand why this queen, this woman, would not fall. They tried tricks, false treaties, sweet promises wrapped in poison. But Nzinga knew better. She had seen what peace meant to colonizers: silence, submission, and slow death. So she chose a different kind of peace, the kind forged by strength. She gathered her people, not just to fight, but to thrive. Refugees were welcomed. Escaped slaves were embraced, not as victims, but as soldiers. Women were trained in the art of war. Elders were consulted as sages. Her palace became a school, a sanctuary, a command center, and a temple. Nzinga didn't just build a kingdom, she built a vision. As decades passed, her enemies began to realize what her people already knew. Nzinga could not be erased. She was not a phase in history, she was history, and she would write it herself. When Portuguese governors came to negotiate again, it was different. They no longer walked into those meetings as rulers. They came as men standing before a queen who had outlived every one of their kings. Nzinga received them with grace, but not softness. They found her sitting tall, her advisors at her side, the room heavy with respect. She spoke with clarity. There would be no more chains, no more betrayal. Any peace would be on her terms, and her people's dignity was non-negotiable. This time, the Portuguese listened, but Nzinga didn't stop with foreign powers. She turned inward, focusing on the soul of her people. It wasn't enough to drive invaders out. Her people had to believe in themselves again. Colonization doesn't just steal land, it steals identity. So Nzinga planted seeds of pride, culture, and memory. She called for elders to teach ancient traditions. Music returned to the villages. Drums beat louder. Dances that had been silenced were danced again in open air. Children were taught not only how to fight, but why. They were told stories of their ancestors, not as slaves, but as warriors, builders, dreamers. They were given back what history had tried to erase. Nzinga aged gracefully. The fire in her eyes never dimmed, even as her steps slowed. In her later years, she would walk the palace gardens at dawn, stopping to speak to servants and guards, listening more than speaking. Her people loved her, not just as a ruler, but as family. She was their protector, their pride, and they knew that her sacrifice had bought them a future. She would often visit the graves of those lost in the struggle, not with tears, but with prayers. She knelt on the earth, pressing her palm into the soil, whispering thanks to those who fought before her. "Your blood was not wasted," she'd murmur. "We are still standing." Nzinga had lived through too much to believe peace would last forever, but she also knew that no empire could conquer a people who remembered who they were. So she preserved their memory. She documented their victories. She passed laws to protect their traditions. She made sure that even if she died, her people would never forget the power of saying no. Her relationship with the Portuguese softened over time, but only slightly. She remained skeptical, always reading between their lines. She continued to negotiate, to trade, to speak, but she never let her guard down. Respect had to be earned, and trust had to be built with action, not words. And yet, Nzinga understood diplomacy, as well as she understood battle. She played the game masterfully, using their need for stability to demand respect. She built alliances with the Dutch. She leaned into trade agreements that empowered her kingdom. She navigated European politics like a seasoned sailor through stormy waters. She became a model across the region. Leaders came to her for advice. Kingdoms studied her governance. Women drew strength from her example. For many, she was no longer just a queen. She was a symbol of what Africa could be: independent, intelligent, proud, and free. In her palace, Nzinga began hosting councils of women from neighboring lands. They shared knowledge, told stories, passed down strategies of resistance. They weren't just leaders, they were the protectors of the continent's soul. Together, they envisioned a future where their children wouldn't be born into chains. Nzinga was always looking ahead. She commissioned roads to better connect her territories. She ensured the marketplace was safe for trade. She increased food production and redistributed land to farmers. She knew that to keep freedom, a nation must feed itself, educate its people, and defend its land. She taught that revolution without rebuilding was just destruction. So she rebuilt, not with brick alone, but with values, with unity, with a vision that refused to see her people as broken. She believed in their brilliance, their strength, and their right to write their own destiny. As she aged, her health began to decline, but her spirit never did. In her final years, she passed more time among children, teaching, telling stories, smiling at their questions. She would say, "You are the reason I fought." Her presence gave the youth a mirror, a reflection of what courage looks like. On quiet nights, she would sit under the stars, her back straight, her eyes full of memories. She spoke to the sky like it was an old friend. "I did all I could," she'd whisper. "Now let them rise." And when the end came, it came without fear. Queen Nzinga died not in battle, not in exile, not in chains, but in her home, surrounded by love and legacy. Her funeral stretched for days. Tribes gathered, drums sounded across the hills, warriors wept, elders sang, daughters carried her spear, sons lifted her banner. She was not mourned as a ruler lost, but celebrated as a queen returned to the ancestors. Even the Portuguese bowed their heads. Even enemies acknowledged the weight of her passing, for they knew a pillar had fallen. A voice had gone quiet, but the echo would never fade. Nzinga's story did not end in her death. It carried on, in the way her people walked, unbent and proud, in the words of mothers teaching their daughters, "Be like Nzinga," in the battles fought years later for independence, where her name was whispered like a blessing, in every act of resistance that said, "We will not be broken." She had redefined what it meant to lead. She had proven that a woman could stand taller than any empire. She had shown that courage wasn't about never falling. It was about rising every single time. Today, Nzinga lives on, not in the pages of colonizers' books, but in the hearts of those who understand what freedom costs. Her statue stands in Luanda, yes, but her true monument is the spirit of Angola itself, alive, fierce, free. So when you hear the wind in the forests of her homeland, listen closely. When you see a girl with fire in her eyes and pride in her step, watch carefully. When you feel something stir in your chest at the sound of drums or the sight of the sunrise over African soil, know that Nzinga is still here. She is not just a name. She is a legacy, a queen who never knelt, a leader who never broke, and a woman who made the world remember Africa does not bow.